Assalamu alaikum and welcome. This series about justice and social change and how we can make positive difference we've been discussing the kind of importance of recognising injustice before we can do something about it. And I'm reminded of the verse of Quran which says about the importance of speaking out and speaking justice. So I'm reminded of the chapter 33 of Quran, verse 70, that talks about fearing Allah and speaking justice, and that being the important thing. So recognising the injustices in order to do that is absolutely important. So today I wanted to talk about another area that's sometimes actually taboo, but often just not thought about, which is around disability and the kind of hatred that is sometimes explicit against people whose bodies are different or whose mental capacity might be different, but also the broader attitudes that we have amongst all of us in all of our societies that constructs people with disabilities as inherently inferior, and the problems that that kind of attitude brings and actually underpins a lot of injustice and not only affects those individuals and communities where there are problems, but brings us all down. It degrades us when we are holding these attitudes and often not thinking about them. So there are examples that, again, I tend to pull on some of the extreme ones because I think they illustrate them most obviously, and that is forms of hate crime against people with disabilities. So in the UK, very recently, we've had a number of cases where people have not only verbally abused people because they look different or because they are disabled, but they have physically attacked and in some cases murdered and tortured individuals solely because those individuals were looked different, were in wheelchairs, spoke differently, their bodies moved differently because of their various genetic or other forms of illness. And although that's absolutely shocking, it begs the question, why would someone feel hostile to someone who looks different in the first place? Why is it that there are people within our societies who feel that it is okay not only to exploit someone who is different or looking weak, but actually attack them, to hate them, to even perhaps fear them? We also have examples of children who are, of course, perhaps more challenging to look after. Often, families who love and love and love their children and who sacrifice a lot to look after them. And these are people who face difficulties themselves. They face stigma of their communities. The idea that they're looking after a child who has these issues is often, they're not necessarily supported, but actually cast out and rejected, as if there's something wrong with the family, as if there's something with that child or family member who, it makes people uncomfortable. We don't know how to handle it. We don't want to look. We don't want to imagine that sort of thing, it can happen to all of us. And that those people who disability does affect are full human beings with rights and feelings and expectations. Again, we have institutions in many of our countries where we shut away people. We shut away people with mental health issues, we shut away people with physical disabilities, and we shut away children whose families, for whatever reason, are not able to look after them, or whose mothers were not fit or able to look after them at that point. So we don't have an idea that we necessarily are integrating different people into our society and supporting them. Sadly, across the world, we see this taboo brought around. The UK mental health services, for example, which are overstretched and underfunded, still have a situation where there are people who need a lot more support than they get. And again, this idea that the wider public is not only disparaging and insulting about these people, whether it's physical or mental health or disability, but also actually hostile. So I want to talk about the kind of attitudes that underpin this fear. And one is the idea that somehow a person whose physical or mental disability is obvious to other people, that somehow they are less human, that they are more animal-like, that they are not equal to the rest of us. And again, that's something to really think about and challenge. And from that we have the medical establishment, which of course is meant to support and help people who have physical and mental challenges, but who in their own way create this stigma, create the idea that somehow someone with disabilities is a broken body, a body that is literally disabled, is less able. The old kind of words that were used for people with disabilities again reflect the kind of attitudes within society, not only from the medical establishment but more broadly. And we have this other idea that disabled people, because they are somehow less human, less equal to us, are less capable of feeling injustice, of less capable of feeling there's an idea that there's a passiveness, an inability, a sort of a person whose views are not equal or as important as the majority able-bodied population. But what's interesting about the whole situation for disabled people and the history of abuse and marginalisation that people have experienced because they are not physically or mentally similar to the rest of the population has created a number of movements and a number of organisations seeking to challenge this. And that's something very exciting. So that we have not disabled people necessarily stranded individually, but accessing organisations in which community organising from a disabled perspective is happening and has begun to happen. So we have a disability rights movement developing where people are demanding that their situations and their particular challenges are not only acknowledged but supported by the broader population, and that our own prejudices are challenged, that we don't see people as voiceless and passive, but we see people as collectively organising and demanding their rights in very open and expressive and vociferous ways. One of the many challenges that disabled people face within our societies is not only from this idea from able-bodied and ably-minded people that somehow we don't even acknowledge the fact that we are prejudiced and that we marginalise people, but also that we lump everyone into one group. We imagine that all disabled people face the same difficulties, all disabled people want the same thing, that all people are somehow the same. So in the same way that we see women being lumped together or the needs of particular minority groups as being somehow homogenous and undifferentiated, we tend to see the disabled problem and disabled people as somehow one. When actually it's important to unpick the different factors that might be influencing the lives and the needs of people, not only beyond their individual needs from a physical or a mental perspective, but in terms of gender, for example. The way that we see disability and gender is different. A disabled man experiences the world differently than a disabled woman based on gender stereotypes that we all have in societies. So that the disabled woman is of course seen as even more passive than that of the disabled man, even more vulnerable, and the assumptions around vulnerability and passivity often turn into very paternalistic attitudes. We are patronising to disabled women more than we are to men. We might not look disabled people in the eye because we're embarrassed, but when it comes to a woman, even more being dehumanised and experiencing this situation. Again, another intersection that we find with disability is around race and ethnicity. So the experience of, in the majority European white situation, the disabled people with white skin and European heritage are treated differently from those who experience racism against them, as well as disability prejudice, as well as perhaps gender prejudices. So we have a whole range of different experiences depending on the kind of identities and the kind of assumptions made about all kinds of elements of somebody's identity. So that disability is part of a broader set of challenges that any one individual or community might face. And that's why organising itself is interesting, in that it has to also recognise the different challenges and different needs of different individuals and groups based on the whole range of prejudices that we as wider society hold against particular people. So I've been talking about the different kinds of prejudices that people with physical and mental disabilities face, partly made much worse by the fact that we don't recognise that we hold these prejudices, that the patronising attitudes, that the ignoring, that the lack of interaction, that the almost fear and embarrassment that we have around some of these issues impacts on individuals and impacts on groups, but that there are ways forward if we recognise the multiple forms of discrimination. So after the break, please join me, because I want to talk more about victimisation to really show the kinds of things people face and then how we might be able to overcome them. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was talking about the experience of disabled people, physically disabled and mentally disabled, who are stigmatised and face so many challenges, not only the challenges that their own physical needs present or mental needs present, but also the overwhelmingly negative attitudes of all of our societies to people who are different and to people who have different needs. And the way that those different challenges are also intersecting with different forms of our identity, so that gender creates different challenges and different experiences, that race and ethnicity and religion also present different challenges, particularly from a religious perspective where we have different attitudes. Of course, Islam absolutely promotes the support of those who face difficulties, and absolutely the importance of speaking out and promoting justice and fearing Allah rather than fearing the prejudices and the stigma and the taboos of our societies. So I wanted to highlight, because we don't always hear about it, the kind of issues that people face who have different forms of disability. And again, this importance of not lumping everyone together, but also seeing that there are certain commonalities. And one of the biggest commonalities that I think is connected to the fact that we don't always even recognise or understand that this is a problem is the fact that when different forms of victimisation are experienced by people with disability, the levels of reporting, the levels of communicating that victimisation to other people are very low. So whether that's formal reporting of crime against a person with disability, the UK statistics, for example, show that we have very low levels of reporting. So we might have high levels of victimisation and crime against individuals, but it doesn't go into the formal system. The police do not hear about it. It doesn't go into the court system, and people are not ultimately punished for the victimisation and hate and cruelty towards individuals with disability. Furthermore, even communicating the fear, hostility and prejudice within our families and within our communities for these individuals can be very difficult. It can be difficult because people are often very vulnerable. When people have physical or mental disabilities, they are more reliant and more dependent upon families and particular individuals. And particularly, and we see a preponderance of abuse coming from within families and within local communities. And when that's the case, again, if you are depending on the people who are abusing you, how do you then report it? How do you challenge it? Because if you challenge that person, or if you challenge those people, you are also creating a situation in which you may not be economically supported. Literally, you may not be fed, you may not be washed. If you're not able to do those things for yourself, it creates a power dynamic that is potentially very difficult and in some cases dangerous for that individual. And then we have what might seem obvious but not necessarily thought about. If somebody can't articulate physically, cannot speak out, or who has not got the mental capacity to articulate what is going on, to speak out about the difficulties and the needs, again, this is a barrier that creates a great level of vulnerability within our societies for people with different needs, for people with disabilities. Another area when we're talking about these problems, and again it's about taboo, not only the taboo of disabilities, but around the bodies of disabled people. People are just not comfortable with people looking different, and we see this, from the taunts that children give each other in the playground when a child looks different, whether it's the shade of their skin or their hair, but also their physical looks. And for those with disabilities, not only in childhood but all the way through adulthood, it's amazing how we are very uncomfortable as broader societies, as able-bodied people, with those who look different. So people with missing limbs or facial features that look different, or who move or are unable to move in different ways, face these problems. And this kind of prejudice is made even more difficult when there are also taboos around sexuality. So we see the sexual abuse of disabled people often far more common than it is in the able-bodied community, because people are vulnerable, because people don't or are not able to speak out. These kind of forms of abuse happen more commonly. And because we're uncomfortable about talking about it, we can't recognise it, we can't see it, or if we do see it, we don't know what to do about it. And for the victims of those kind of abuse, again, like child victims of the abuse or other victims, vulnerable, those who face other forms of domestic violence, again, speaking out about it against someone who might also be someone with power over them, or who is the one who feeds them, it becomes very difficult to address as well. But it's also important, as well as talking about the voicelessness and disempowerment of people with disabilities and of all sorts of different kinds, there are also those individuals who are able to speak out and who do speak out and who are empowering and connecting with other people. Those, for example, with autistic on the autistic spectrum, whose memories may be fantastic and who may find some forms of our normative social behaviour difficult to interact with, but who are absolutely able to express, remember in detail, and speak out about not only the challenges that they face, but that other people might face too. So actually, it's important that we don't see people just in a victim mode, that victimization is common, but that people aren't inherently victim in a perpetual state of victimhood, and that empowerment, self-empowerment and the empowerment of other people are possible, that people aren't relegated to suffering, and that positive change can happen. So as well as the local community organisation, and actually this is absolutely helped by those who have access to the internet, for example. If one can use a computer, if a person can connect online, it can often be more easy for them than physically going out, or the various challenges that physical movement or travel can cause. So the online internet forums are something that have been extremely empowering. Also, the importance not only to local level, that us as families and communities recognise and address these issues, and really look into our own hearts and think, why do I feel uncomfortable about this issue? Why am I not speaking out more vocally? Why am I not looking around and seeing who needs my support? But also trying to change the legal structure and the state structures that are prejudicial to people with these kind of needs. So of course we see the, and it's the case across all societies, where the experience of able-bodied, wealthy men tends to be seen as they access services more easily, they access the law more easily, and in fact they often are the law. They are the police officers, they are the judges, they are the juries, and they are the prison officers. So if we see a system that is not necessarily actively or purposely hostile to people with difference, but not understanding, we see that there is more communication needed. And in particular, the idea that we not only recognise the kind of crimes, but also recognise the challenges to reporting them and to understanding what can be done about them. The forms of victimisation of a person who is very uncomfortable about talking about what's happened to them. This is the case also for often women who have faced domestic violence, being able to talk about their situation and understand that the fear that is created can be a barrier to moving on and moving ahead and trying to get convictions, for example. Rape victims are in a similar situation. They do not report, and when they do report, they're often not believed by police officers or by the court systems. Similarly, disabled people, particularly for those people who have mental disabilities, if they talk about forms of victimisation or forms of prejudice they may face, they are labelled as hysterical or fantasists or lying or confused or just unable to articulate clearly what's happened. So that not only is the fear of reporting actually being believed, and that case being moved on within our courts is difficult. So it's absolutely crucial that we raise awareness through organising and through speaking and through demanding our rights, not only the rights of ourselves as individuals, but the rights of those around us, and that those rights must be recognised by the state and by state institutions. And these issues also relate to not necessarily just mental disability, but mental health issues. And mental health is something that, again, we talk about or don't talk about because of the taboos around it. The fear of people with mental health issues, the fear of violence from people with mental health issues is vastly imagined and overwhelms the actual reality of people with different issues, whether it's very common mental health issues such as depression, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which are extremely common amongst many people that we all know, and ourselves who may not even vocalise that we have these problems, but also to the more extreme forms of mental health or that present more extreme challenges, for example schizophrenia, where people's mental distress and mental confusion often renders them as victims to other people more than the imagined form of perpetrators of violence or perpetrators of confusion within our societies. So the people who we fear are often the people who should fear us much more. And addressing these issues and recognising them are absolutely crucial to overcoming something that is a form of injustice within all our communities and all of our societies. The exploitation, hatred and prejudice towards difference, and particularly physical and mental difference. That may be something that can get better. Of course, mental health issues and mental health illnesses are often things that people get better from. But people get better because they have the support and acceptance of those around them, not only their immediate families, but the broader social situation that doesn't make them feel alienated and not part of society. And similarly for those whose physical bodies will not ever become like the majority of able-bodied people, but who can, if we think about it, and support them more, whether it's simple things like access to buildings, access to technology, access to things that make people's lives easier, this is something that's absolutely crucial. So thank you for joining me, and inshallah, please join me again for the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.